Romans chapter 6, verses 12 and 13. Therefore, do not let sin reign in your mortal body, that you should obey its lusts. And do not go on presenting the members of your body to sin as instruments of unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness to God. Thank you for being a part of this conversation with me as we continue looking at God words. Reading through the letter to the Romans and finding terms that are important for us to understand as we consider God's invitation to fellowship with himself. The word today that we read in these two verses in Romans chapter 6 is the word instruments. It's an interesting translation of the word that the Apostle Paul used when he wrote this letter. When we think of instruments, for me anyway, the first thing that comes to mind is a musical instrument. And I suppose that we could apply a musical instrument in this situation, that we are being encouraged to be a part of a symphony and to play on tune and to play our part rather than to play out of tune and to not follow the conductor and to produce beautiful music. However, that's not the word that is used here in Paul's letter to the Romans. The word that is actually used here, and instruments is, I suppose, an okay translation if we put it into the right context and the right idea. The word is really tools or items that we use in warfare. So I suppose we could use instruments or implements for agriculture, but more the sense here is the instruments used in warfare. So swords, spears, bows and arrows, shields in the scriptural context. In our context, armor and various types of firearms, depending on what period of history we're looking at. Armored vehicles, all sorts of things that are used in warfare. And that's really the word that is used here as Paul makes a very important encouragement to those of us who have been baptized, to those of us who have had our old nature put to death, and to whom God has given a new nature through baptism, through our participation in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. So what we find here as we're using this term, instruments, tools, implements, is that the regenerated person, in a sense, has some choices to make. We want to be careful with the use of the word choice. We recognize that the old nature is born dead. Kind of funny to say born dead, but Ephesians chapter 2 begins with reminding us that we were dead in our trespasses and sin. And so while the body lives, and the spirit in some sense, because it's connected to the body, and we want to look at the person, the whole person, in the sense of the wholeness of the person that we really find in Hebrew mentality and culture. We don't want to separate the person out into different pieces that aren't related to each other or function together. So we have the body, but as humans, we have something different that is in us that maybe we could call it our consciousness, our ability to communicate and reason, even the ability to be in fellowship with God and to understand and know that fellowship, which is different than the rest of creation and the animal kingdom. That we are not members of the animal kingdom, but that we are a unique creation in the image of God, into whom he has breathed his spirit and life. And yet we understand that our soul, and I suppose we could get into some kind of big discussion about whether the spirit and the soul are the same thing. Some people think that they're synonymous, some people think that they're different. But there is this piece of us that is the part that can communicate with God, the part to whom his Holy Spirit comes, and we have this interaction with God. The part that when the body dies does not die, does not cease to exist. And I suppose in a sense our bodies even, because they will be resurrected, there isn't a ceasing of existence there, but there is an end of breathing and function of the body. But what we see here is that we are given this new nature, and that new nature controls all of who we are. And that though the dead self cannot choose to follow and obey God, to live in fellowship with God, the new nature can choose to continue to disobey. Now remember, we're in the context here in Romans chapter 6 of the question, should we continue to sin so that grace may abound? The question being, if God is a gracious God, why don't we just sin boldly and liberally so that God can be more gracious, so that God can have more opportunity to pour out his graciousness? And the reply that is made to that question is an absolutely not, because our old nature has died and we've been given a new nature. And so now when we get to 12 and 13 of chapter 6, we see that we are being told that we are not to use who we are, and this is a physical thing, because he says that we are not to use the members, literally the limbs of our bodies, to do, that is, as instruments or as tools for wickedness, for sin. That we are not to allow sin to come back and take control in our lives. And that instead then of using our bodies, our limbs, the members of our body, to commit acts contrary to God's will, as instruments of unrighteousness, as tools to do wrong, that we are to offer and give the members of our bodies, our limbs, our whole being, to God as instruments for righteousness, to do good. And it's interesting, I think, that the word here is a military term, because what we find is that we are engaged in spiritual battle. We will look, when we get to chapter 7, at the battle. Paul recognized it. Paul recognized that this is a struggle that we have. We saw it in our discussion of the word slave and slavery. That's a term that Paul, I think, used somewhat reluctantly, but knowing that people would understand what it means, that we are slaves of whoever it is that we obey. And that obeying is mental, spiritual, physical, it's the whole person. And it's not separated out into little Greek philosophical categories. And that if we offer our bodies as instruments, as tools for unrighteousness, then we are enslaving ourselves to sin again. But that the encouragement here is that we resist the temptations, that we are actively engaged in spiritual warfare, knowing that it is the character of the recreated, the character of the regenerated, the character of the new creation that has been given to us by God, that it is the character of the new nature to do what is right, to become obedient, to be obedient, and again, in terms that are not satisfying or fully acceptable to how we reason things, enslave ourselves to Christ. To offer ourselves as tools in the spiritual battle to do what is right. So we have the word instruments. Offer the members of your body, your limbs. This is physical doing in the world, motivated by the spiritual regeneration to do and live out what is right, to gladly and willingly be subject to the God who created the universe and gave us his law, not to make life miserable for us, not as a killjoy, but to protect us and to keep us in his will. Thank you for being a part of this conversation with me. God bless you.